And one of the objections that non-Christians, Christians who are not Catholic have about the Mass is that, like, Jesus isn't anywhere in this building. It's just a bunch of, like, ornamented gold weird stuff that I've never seen before in my life. Well, to kind of emphasize the idea that Jesus really is the focus of the Mass, and not just the theological focus and not just the ritual focus, but there's a visual focus on him, even if you go into a Catholic church and there is no liturgy taking place. But if you do go to a liturgy, there are at least, and this is in almost every Catholic church you will go to, unless there's something strange going on, you will find 16 explicit, visible representations of Jesus Christ our Lord. So, number one, the first one you'll see is the one that is very often hanging up behind the main altar where all the action is, right? So whatever else is going to happen, if you're going to have an image of Christ, you're probably going to have one there. Second of all, when we get into the procession of the priest coming into Mass, and Ken is going to talk about this more, often the first person in the line is carrying up a crucifix with our Lord on it. And then the other 14, to get us up to 16, are all along the walls of the church, the 14 stations of the cross in every single church just about, in some way or another. And if you don't know what the stations of the cross are, it's like this meditative walk through the passion and death of our Lord, because the church takes very seriously what St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, when he is saying, and this is in 1 Corinthians 1:23, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews, foolishness to Gentiles, but unto those who are being saved, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. And he goes on to say, just a few verses later in chapter 2, that he resolved to know nothing, right, when he was among the Corinthians except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And we stick to that, right? 16 different places in almost every single church building you'll ever walk to, a Catholic church building. But most of them, it's more.
Right.
Because in my church, we also have an image of the Holy Family and St. Joseph cradling Jesus in the back left corner. We got an image of Jesus pointing to his Sacred Heart in the back right corner. We got Mary holding the baby Jesus up front and to the side. We got, the lobby is full of just, it's go to a local Catholic church visit and count the images of Christ, right? Just go count them.
It's everywhere.
So those are the explicit visible images of Christ. But there are a lot of places and pieces of how the church is set up that are visible representations that evoke Jesus. So for instance, if you look at the way that a church is structured, it's kind of like this big, long, rectangular thing going forward. But for some reason, when you get up to the front, there's these side pockets. Well, if you were to look at that from the top, what you're going to see is a cross, right? And the altar, which is also a symbol of Christ, is at the intersection of the horizontal and vertical beams of that architectural cross. It's built into the language of the building, right? And then there's iconography and imagery from all of salvation history all around you. If you look at the stained glass, depending on where you are, you know, you're going to see images from the life of Christ, images from, you know, perhaps the mysteries of the Rosary, mapping out like the Annunciation of the Lord, the Visitation, the Nativity. Depending on where you are, there's going to be something somewhere that points to the reality of the communion of saints, the reality of the purity of St. Joseph as protector, the reality of Mary as the mother of Christ. There's going to be all these images that point to like people who knew him, people who loved him in this life. They are with us to help us enter into a better understanding of who Christ is as the focus of everything we're doing here. So you got that. You've got the explicit visible representations of God, of Christ. You've got the visible representations that evoke him, like the altar and the shape of the building. But then you have the tangible reminders of his sacramental presence, which will be, you know, on the altar there at the Eucharist being celebrated, but also is probably already present in some real form when you walk in before Mass starts. Because if you ever look back at the tabernacle, first of all, the tabernacle is where consecrated hosts are kept, right? When there's not Mass going on. And the way that you know whether or not there's hosts in there that are consecrated is there's a lamp next to it, usually a red one. And if the candle is lit, that means there are consecrated hosts inside that tabernacle.
Yes.
It's a reminder of the sacramental presence of Christ, right? And this goes back, and we could go into it, and there are other, Brant Petrie, of course, spends a lot of time on this kind of thing in Jesus and the Jewish Roots in the Eucharist, about why that idea of a lamp next to a tabernacle is not something that Catholics made up in the Middle Ages, right? It is part of our heritage as the people of God who wandered in the desert with the tent, right? Before it ever came to the point of having a Messiah. And with that idea of the sacramental presence of Jesus, so maybe you're okay with the visual images of Christ at the 14 stations in the crucifix. Maybe you're okay with the idea that the altar maybe represents Christ, that the building is shaped in a way that evokes Christ. But maybe you're not okay with the Eucharist and think that it's idolatry, that we're worshiping a wafer. Well, I would just have you consider this in regard to that, and that is that if it's true what Catholics believe about what's happening in that tabernacle and on that altar, then at least in our mind, we are not committing idolatry, because we are worshiping Christ because he told us that that's him. Yeah. We believe, we take him at his word, right? There's nobody in there that thinks, nobody in there that's supposed to think anyway, I'm going to worship this piece of bread, and then I'll also, over this side of my mind, think about Jesus. No, there's not a separation in what the church is calling us to do in that moment. So you may disagree with us. You may disagree with what our interpretation is of what Jesus is saying there, but it's not idolatry if we believe that's really Christ present among us, right? Yeah. So those are the things that I would sort of add in terms of like the visual things that are going on.